We were having dinner at our usual steakhouse when my wife stepped away to take a call. A night shift attendant slid a worn leather envelope under my hand and murmured, "Don't let her see this. You'll understand before sunrise." His fingers were shaking. Before I could ask anything, he vanished into the kitchen and I hid it like my life depended on it. My name is Ethan Cole, and I'm 49 years old. I used to think I had my life figured out, not because it was glamorous, but because it was predictable, and predictable felt safe. I live in a small desert town built around a reservoir and an old flood control dam, the kind of place where the sky looks bigger than the houses, and the wind sounds like it's always carrying secrets across empty streets. People here don't rush, they settle, they repeat. And I was the definition of repeat. I woke up at the same time every morning. Coffee, black, in the same mug. 10 minutes of news I barely listened to. Then I drove to whichever site needed me that day: housing developments, roadwork bids, utility meetings, real estate and infrastructure, the unsexy kind of work that keeps towns running and keeps a man busy enough to feel important. I didn't have a huge circle. A couple of guys I'd known through business, a neighbor who waved when he watered his gravel yard. I wasn't lonely in the dramatic way people imagine. I was contained, like my life had edges, and I stayed inside them. And then there was Rachel. If you met her, you'd think, that's a good woman, the kind you bring home to your mother. Soft voice, steady smile. She knew how to make a house feel lived in without making it feel crowded. She had this little garden out back: cacti, desert flowers, plants that survived on almost nothing. She'd kneel in the dust with her gloves on, humming like she was praying. And when she looked up at me, her eyes always said the same thing: "I see you." That's what I fell for. Not the looks, not the charm, the feeling that someone finally understood the parts of me I never bothered to explain. At night, she'd ask about my day like it mattered, not just how was work, but what part wore you down. She'd remember small things. The meeting I was nervous about, the name of a foreman who kept pushing deadlines, the fact that I hated eating late. She'd put dinner on the table at the same time, almost like she was protecting my routine, like she respected the way I lived. And I mistook that for love, because that's what stability does. It convinces you that repetition equals loyalty, that consistency equals safety, that if nothing is changing, nothing is wrong. But looking back, there were cracks. Quiet ones, the kind you don't notice until the whole wall shifts. Rachel was private with her phone, not in a suspicious, obvious way, in a polished way. Screen tilted just enough. Notifications silenced. Calls taken in another room with the door half closed, like she didn't want to disturb me. Sometimes she'd be sitting right beside me on the couch, and her phone would buzz, and I'd feel her body tense just for a second before she smiled and said, "It's work. I'll be right back." Work. Always work. And I'd nod, because I wanted to be the kind of husband who trusted, the kind who didn't interrogate, the kind who didn't ruin a good thing by acting insecure. There were moments, too small, physical moments that didn't match the warmth of her words. She'd reach for my hand across the table, her fingers sliding into mine, and they'd be cold. Not from the weather, from somewhere else, like her body was doing what her mind told it to do. But her heart wasn't there. And every time it happened, I'd explain it away. Long day, stress, a headache, too much on her mind. That's the trap, isn't it? When you've built your life on routine, you start protecting it. You don't want to shake it. You don't want to look too closely, because if you look too closely, you might have to admit that the thing you call peace is actually just practice. Practice for something you don't see coming. So I kept living my days the same way. Same wake-up, same drive, same work, same dinner, same bed, and on the outside, it looked like a good life. But that night at the steakhouse, with that worn leather envelope pressed under my palm, something in me finally understood a truth I wish I'd learned years earlier. Sometimes stability isn't safety. Sometimes it's just a pattern, one that someone else has been studying. When we got home that night, Rachel went straight into the kitchen like nothing had happened. She hung her purse on the same hook by the door. She kicked off her shoes in the same spot. She asked if I wanted tea in the same gentle voice she always used when she was trying to make the house feel calm. And I nodded, because that was the dance we'd been doing for years, but my attention wasn't on her. It was on the envelope. That worn leather thing felt heavier now than it had at the table. Not because it weighed more, but because I could feel what it represented. A rupture, a crack in the routine. Rachel moved around the kitchen. The soft clink of a spoon against a mug, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of water running. All the ordinary noises you don't notice until your body starts treating them like background music to something dangerous. I went to my study like I always did after dinner. Same chair, same lamp, same stack of papers I pretended to care about. Then I pulled the envelope out of my jacket and just stared at it. For a full minute, I didn't open it. I thought about the man who handed it to me, not his name. I didn't even know his name. I thought about his eyes. He didn't look excited. He didn't look like someone who wanted drama or attention or some movie moment where he gets to be the hero. He looked like someone who had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. And now he was trying to survive the fact that he'd seen it. His hands had been shaking. Not fake shaking. Not, I'm nervous because this is risky shaking. It was deeper than that. It was the kind of fear that comes from realizing you've stepped too close to the wrong people. And that's when the obvious question hit me. Why didn't I go back? Why didn't I stand up, follow him into the kitchen, grab his arm, and say, "What is this? Where did you get it? Who are you?" Because that's what people say they'd do. That's what the comments always say after the fact. But real life isn't a clean story where every mystery gets a neat answer. Real life has consequences for curiosity. If I chased him down, I wouldn't just be asking a question. I'd be dragging him into the center of it. And I could tell, just from the way he moved, that he didn't want to be in the center of anything. He wanted to drop the match and walk away before the fire noticed him. I sat there and pictured it. Me walking back into that restaurant, asking around, insisting to speak to him, making him visible. And then what, maybe Rachel sees me through the window. Maybe someone texts her. Maybe she asks later, too calmly, "Why did you go back?" And now she knows something changed. Or maybe it's worse. Maybe the wrong person notices I'm talking. Maybe the person who handed me that envelope gets pulled aside after his shift. Maybe he disappears. And then I'm left with two things: an unanswered question, and the weight of knowing I made it worse for the one person who tried to do the right thing. There are situations where the smartest person in the room is not the one who asks the most questions. It's the one who knows which questions can get someone killed. That's the ugly truth. In stories, the helpful stranger stays, explains everything, points you to the villain, gives you a map, and maybe even calls the police for you. In real life, the helpful stranger shows up once, does one dangerous thing, and then vanishes. Because vanishing is how people like that stay alive. And if you think about it, it makes a brutal kind of sense. If he knew enough to warn me, he knew enough to understand what happens to people who talk too much. So I didn't chase him. I didn't go back. I didn't try to turn him into a character in my story. I let him stay what he needed to be, a shadow that passed information and survived. And I did the only thing I could do that night without turning myself into a target before I even knew what game I was in. I locked the door. I kept my face calm. And I held that envelope like it was a live wire. Because some questions are absolutely correct. But asked at the wrong time, they don't give you answers. They give your enemies a reason to move faster. I waited until the house was quiet. Rachel had gone upstairs first, the way she always did, one hand on the banister, the other holding her phone like it was an extension of her body. She kissed my cheek at the top of the stairs and said, "Don't work too late." That sentence used to sound like love. That night, it sounded like a script line. I stayed downstairs with a mug of tea I didn't drink, listening to the little sounds of the house settling, wood cooling, pipes clicking, the faint rush of wind against the windows, the same familiar environment that had always made me feel safe. Then I pulled the leather envelope back out. It was dry, cracked at the corners, like it had been handled 100 times and never meant to be seen in daylight. The kind of thing you'd find in the bottom drawer of a desk that nobody else is allowed to open. I set it on my desk and just stared at it again, because opening it meant accepting one thing. Whatever was inside was going to change the shape of my life. I slid my finger under the flap. No dramatic lock, no fancy seal, just stiff leather and the faint smell of dust, like it had been stored near old paper and hot machinery. Inside was a digital voice recorder, not a phone, not a flash drive, not some spy movie gadget, a recorder, the kind construction foremen use on job sites when their hands are dirty and they need to capture measurements, notes, timelines, the kind you'd clip to your belt without thinking twice. And underneath it was a small scrap of paper. One word. Listen. That was it. No explanation, no signature, no good luck, just a command. I picked up the recorder and turned it over in my hands. A few scratches on the back, a little scuff near the battery latch. The screen was dull, like it had been touched too many times by nervous fingers. My thumb hovered over the power button, and I remember thinking, for a second, maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. Maybe I'm about to feel stupid. Then I pressed it. The screen blinked on. A list of audio files appeared, stacked neatly with dates and times. Not random names, not recording one or memo, actual timestamps. Like someone was keeping track of moments the way an accountant keeps track of dollars. I scrolled slowly. My heart wasn't racing yet. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of stillness you feel right before your body decides whether to run or fight. The first file was from 3 weeks earlier. The next was a week after that. Then one from 2 days ago. Whoever did this didn't record once. They recorded repeatedly. They were building something. I hit play on the most recent file. At first it was just noise, air conditioning, distant clatter, the muffled sound of voices somewhere behind a door. Then a laugh. A woman's laugh. Soft. Controlled. Like she knew she was being charming. I didn't recognize it at first. And then I did. Because you don't forget the sound of the person you sleep next to. Rachel. My stomach dropped in a slow, sick way. Not like a punch. Like the floor lowering under your feet without warning. Her voice was followed by another. A man. Confident. Practical. Like someone used to explaining risk in clean, simple terms. He said something about coverage and exposure. He didn't sound like a guy planning a crime. He sounded like a guy planning a project. And that's what chilled me the most. Rachel murmured something back. And then I heard a third voice, calmer, colder. The kind of voice that doesn't ask for permission. Claire. I hadn't even met her more than a handful of times. But I remembered her energy. Always polite, always watching, always too composed. In the recording, she didn't sound like a friend. She sounded like someone running a meeting. I paused the audio and sat there for a second, staring at the wall as if it could steady me. Then I hit play again. They weren't talking about feelings. They weren't arguing. They weren't even whispering like people who know they're doing something wrong. They were coordinating. Rachel said my name like it was a file folder. Not my husband. Not Ethan. Just my name, followed by details. He's at the site early. He always checks the spillway. He likes to walk that stretch alone. Claire responded without emotion. Then we don't improvise. We stick to the route. We stick to the timing. The man later I'd learn exactly who he was. But in that moment he was just. A voice said, "The payout doesn't come clean unless it reads like negligence, not murder." Negligence? Negligence. That word landed in my chest like a weight. Because negligence doesn't just kill you, it blames you. The audio continued. They talked about the reservoir dam like it was a piece on a board. They mentioned a slick section near the maintenance path, the kind of spot that gets a thin film of algae right before sunrise. They talked about a blind camera angle, about who would be first on scene, about how a report would be written. Then Rachel said something that made my hands go cold. Once the ownership paperwork shifts, it's done. He won't even see it coming. Ownership paperwork. Not just money, not just insurance, property, control. A piece of land near the dam that I'd been fighting for in a bidding dispute for months, something that was supposed to be my next big win in town. I realized, in real time, that they weren't just planning a death. They were planning a transfer, like moving assets after a storm. I stopped the recording again. My tea had gone cold. The room felt colder too, even though the thermostat hadn't changed. I looked down at the recorder like it was an animal that had crawled into my house. And I finally understood something I wish I'd learned earlier in life. Modern evil doesn't always show up with a weapon. Sometimes it shows up with paperwork, with timelines, with a story that sounds reasonable on paper. Because if you can make a death look like a mistake, you can make everyone accept it faster. I scrolled through the file list again. There were more recordings, more dates, more times, and suddenly, the leather envelope didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like evidence. Like someone had reached into the dark and handed me the one thing Rachel and her friends never expected me to touch. Their plan wasn't hidden in what they said to my face. It was hidden in what they documented when they thought nobody was listening. So I leaned forward, took a breath, and pressed play on the next file. Because whatever was coming, I needed to hear all of it. I kept listening, not because I wanted to, not because I was curious, because once you hear your own name inside someone else's plan, you don't get to go back to sleep. I sat there at my desk with that recorder in my hand, the screen glowing a dull blue in the dark. The house was still. The same house Rachel had decorated with warm lamps and soft blankets. The same house that smelled like her hand lotion and the cactus soil from the sunroom. I used to think those details meant home. That night, they felt like props. I scrolled to an older file. 2 weeks back, hit play. More background noise. A door shutting. Someone pouring a drink. A chair scraping across a floor. Then Claire's voice again, steady. Calm, like she was reading a checklist. We don't need drama. We need it to make sense on paper. On paper. That phrase stuck in my head because I live in a world where paper matters. Contracts, bids, permits, inspections. I've sat through meetings where people fought for 3 hours over a single line in a document. And here she was, using the same mindset to plan a death. Rachel spoke next. Gentle, almost playful. He won't suspect me. He still thinks I worry too much. I felt my jaw tighten. But my face didn't move because she wasn't wrong. I did think that. I thought her worry was love. I thought her checking in on me was care. I thought her asking what time I'd be at the site was just her wanting to feel close to my day. I hit pause, stared at the wall. Then I hit play again. That's when I heard the man's voice more clearly, the confident one, the one who talked like numbers were the only language worth speaking. "Lucas Grant," Claire said, like she was introducing him to the room. Then Lucas responded, "If you want it clean, the report has to mention safety violations. That's the key. If it's just a fall, they'll dig. If it's negligence, they'll close the file fast." My stomach turned, because I knew what that meant. They weren't just planning to kill me, they were planning to blame me for it, to make me the kind of man people shake their heads about at a funeral. Such a shame. He was always taking shortcuts, always pushing deadlines. He should have been more careful. It's one thing to imagine dying. It's another thing to imagine dying and being turned into a cautionary tale. I fast-forwarded a little, thumb sliding over the button, my breath shallow. Then I heard it. The dam, not mentioned like a landmark, mentioned like a tool. "There's that maintenance stretch on the east side," Lucas said. "Before sunrise it gets slick. People don't see it until it's too late," Claire answered. "And the camera." Lucas didn't hesitate. "There's a blind spot near the utility gate. A dead angle. I checked. I felt something cold crawl up my spine. Because I knew that gate. I've walked past it 100 times. I've stood there with engineers and pointed at cracks in concrete like it was the most important thing in the world. I'd even joked once that the place felt deserted at that hour." Deserted. That word didn't feel funny anymore. Rachel's voice came in again. Quieter. "He goes there alone. He likes being there when it's empty." And Claire said, "Then that's where it happens. Not if, not maybe. When." I pulled the recorder away from my ear, like distance could soften the truth. My hands were steady. I remember noticing that because it scared me even more. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was calculating, because my brain finally caught up to what my heart didn't want to accept. They weren't planning a divorce. They weren't planning a breakup. They weren't even planning to run away together like some stupid romance. They were planning an absence. Mine. I clicked into another file. This one had a different tone. The voices were closer, less careful. Rachel sounded tired, like she'd been holding a smile too long. "How much longer?" she asked. Lucas answered, "Soon. It has to be soon. If we wait, the timing doesn't work." Claire cut in immediately. "We're not waiting." Then there was a silence. Not comfortable, not thoughtful, heavy. And then Rachel said something I didn't expect to hear in a conversation about killing me. "I can't keep doing this if I'm, you know." Lucas's voice softened, almost protective. "We already talked about it. The baby changes the timeline. That's all. The baby." I replayed that line. Once, twice. My throat went dry. Baby meant one thing. It meant something was already in motion, something irreversible, something they were building their future around. And I was in the way. I leaned back in my chair and stared at my own reflection in the dark window. The glass showed a man sitting in a quiet house, holding a recorder, listening to his wife talk about another life growing inside her. I thought about all the little caring things Rachel had done lately, how she'd started packing my lunches again, healthier lunches, less salt, less red meat. How she'd asked me to stop running at night and stick to mornings so you're not out there alone. How she'd started insisting I wear my safety vest even when I wasn't on an active site. How she'd gotten oddly interested in the dam schedule, asking when maintenance crews would be out there. At the time, it felt like love. Now it felt like surveillance dressed up as affection. That's the part people don't understand until it happens to them. The scariest betrayal isn't the kind that comes with yelling. It's the kind that comes with a warm smile and a steady hand on your arm. It's the kind that tucks you in at night, and then goes downstairs to plan where you'll fall. I stood up and walked through the living room slowly, like my body didn't belong to me anymore. The couch, the framed photos, the little bowl Rachel kept by the door for keys. The cactus in the corner, she insisted, was impossible to kill. Everything looked the same, but none of it felt real, because suddenly I could see it. My routine wasn't a comfort anymore. It was a map. My discipline wasn't admirable anymore. It was predictable. My peaceful life wasn't peaceful. It was controlled. And the worst part was this. They weren't counting on me to fight back. They were counting on me to stay who I'd always been: quiet, consistent, trusting. A man who believed that if someone holds your hand, they must mean you well. That was the moment it clicked. They didn't want to leave. They wanted me to disappear. And once I understood that, I knew I had two choices. I could confront Rachel and start a fire I couldn't control, or I could stay calm, stay alive, and start taking my life back one quiet decision at a time. Follow this story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches, because what happened to me can happen to anyone who thinks routine means safe. After I heard my own name inside their plan, I didn't sleep much, but the next morning, I still made coffee, I still rinsed the mug, I still put on my work boots like it was just another Tuesday. That's the part people don't understand. They think survival looks like a dramatic moment screaming, confrontation, slamming doors, calling the cops while your hands shake. Sometimes survival looks like you buttering toast, while your mind is building an exit plan. Rachel came into the kitchen in one of my old t-shirts, hair pulled back, voice soft. She kissed my cheek like she always did. Then she asked the same harmless question she'd asked 1,000 times. "What time are you heading out today?" And I felt my body go cold, because now I knew what that question really was. Not curiosity, not care, a checkpoint. I smiled anyway. Just enough, not too much. I kept my voice steady. Same as usual. I said, "Couple site stops. I'll be back before dinner." Rachel nodded like that information settled something inside her. She poured herself coffee, and she didn't even realize her hand was slightly shaking. Or maybe she did, and she thought I was too blind to notice. That's the thing about people who live off control. They start believing the world is a stage built for them, and everyone else is just an extra. I took my breakfast to the table. The newspaper was there, folded the way she liked it. The cactus in the sunroom caught the morning light, the little spines glowing like silver needles. Everything looked peaceful, and that's when it hit me. Peace can be manufactured. Peace can be a costume. Peace can be a tool. Because if you can keep someone calm, predictable, and grateful, you can lead them anywhere. I could have stood up right then and said, "I heard everything." I could have watched her face change. I could have demanded answers. I could have forced a confession. But that would have been for my pride, not for my life. So I stayed quiet. And I need you to hear this, because people in the comments always ask the same question. "Why didn't you go straight to the police?" I asked myself that too. Over and over. It sounds so simple when you're safe on your couch watching a story unfold. But in real life, the fastest move isn't always the smartest one. Because what I had in my hands that night wasn't a neat package. It was a recorder from an anonymous source with chopped up conversations and file names. No chain of custody, no witness willing to go on record, no proof where it came from. If I walked into a police station and said, "My wife is planning to kill me," you know what happens next. They don't arrest her on the spot. They verify, they interview, they ask questions. And while they're doing that, they would likely send someone to talk to Rachel, or they'd file a report. And the second Rachel realizes I've spoken to law enforcement, the game changes, not in my favor. Because then I become the man who knows too much, without being protected yet. There's a brutal rule in situations like this. The person who knows the truth before they can prove it is the person most likely to get erased. And I could already hear how they talked about making it look clean, about closing the file fast, about paper. These weren't impulsive people. They were planners. If I forced them to improvise, they'd improvise with my life. So instead of running to the police with something they could poke holes in, I did what I've always done in my career. I built a case. That might sound cold, but it's the difference between being right and being alive. There's a concept people don't like to admit, because it bruises the ego. In moments of real danger, your emotions are not your compass. They're your liability. And most of us were raised to believe the opposite. We were taught, if you're hurt, speak up. If you're wronged, demand justice immediately. If you're betrayed, confront it. But that advice only works when both people are still playing by normal rules. When the person across from you is willing to feel guilt. When they still care what you think. When they still have a line they won't cross. Rachel and her friends had already crossed the line. They weren't thinking, how do we fix this? They were thinking, how do we finish this? So I did the only thing that gave me a chance. I delayed my reaction. Not because I was weak, because I needed time to collect power. That's what silence was for. Silence gave me room to think without being watched. Silence gave me time to copy the files, to catalog dates, to listen again and again until the scattered pieces became a timeline. Silence kept Rachel acting normal, and as long as she was acting normal, I could keep moving without triggering whatever plan B they had tucked away. That day, I drove to my first site meeting like nothing was wrong. I shook hands. I signed off on materials. I nodded through conversations about budgets and deadlines, and all the while, I felt like I was living two lives at the same time. One where I was a normal man with a normal marriage, and one where every good morning was a performance, and every kiss was a test. That night, Rachel made dinner like she always did. Chicken, roasted vegetables, a little glass of wine for herself. She talked about the sunroom, about how one of the cactus buds might bloom soon. I watched her hands as she spoke. I watched her eyes when she mentioned the dam, casually, like it was just scenery. And I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The people who do the most damage don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they look gentle. Sometimes they look like the person who remembers how you take your coffee. And that's why I didn't explode. That's why I didn't accuse. That's why I didn't run out the door the second I heard the recordings. Because the man who rushes to prove he's right often becomes the man they bury. And I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not before I had a plan. Not before I had enough evidence that they couldn't talk their way out of it. Not before I had a stage where they couldn't reach me. Because once I understood the rules they were playing by, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight them with anger. I was going to fight them with structure, with timing, with proof, and the quiet part. The part no one tells you. Sometimes the moment you stop talking is the moment you start taking your life back. The next 2 days felt like I was walking around with a storm sealed inside my chest. On the outside, nothing changed. I went to meetings. I answered emails. I signed paperwork at job sites. I nodded at the same faces I'd nodded at for years. I even laughed at a joke one of my subcontractors told me, and it sounded normal enough that nobody looked twice. But every time my phone buzzed, every time Rachel asked a small question, every time the sun dropped behind the hills and the town got quiet, I could hear those recordings in my head like an echo. So that night, I did what I'd started doing in secret. I waited until Rachel went to bed. I turned off the kitchen light, and I sat alone at the dining table with that recorder in my hands. Like it was a live wire, I hit play again, and this time I wasn't listening like a shocked husband. I was listening like a man trying to stay alive. I opened the journal that came with it, those little timestamps and file names that looked so harmless at first, like someone's personal organization system, like a work log. Only it wasn't a work log, it was a countdown. The first file I replayed was labeled with a date 2 days away. Wednesday, 4:38 a. I remember staring at that number and feeling something in me sink, because it wasn't vague. It wasn't sometime soon. It was scheduled, the kind of scheduled you do when you're booking a flight, or ordering concrete, or setting an alarm for a meeting you don't plan to miss. I pressed play. At first it was just background noise, like wind hitting a microphone, a car door shutting, a faint hum that sounded like someone recording from inside a jacket pocket. Then a voice came through, low and calm. Lucas. He wasn't speaking like a man fantasizing. He was speaking like a man explaining procedure. Before sunrise is best. Less traffic, fewer witnesses. Another voice responded, lighter, almost amused. Claire. And the cameras, Lucas let out a short breath, like she was asking something too easy. There's a blind stretch near the maintenance gate. Everyone knows it. That's where you want him. I paused it. My hands were still. My mouth was dry. Maintenance gate. Blind stretch. Those weren't the words of someone hoping. Those were the words of someone who'd walked it, measured it, marked it. I hit play again. Lucas kept talking, and the more he talked, the more I understood something that made my skin crawl. They weren't just planning to end me. They were planning to write the story of my death before it happened. And it can't look like a crime, Lucas said. It has to look like a reason, a mistake. Claire chuckled softly. A mistake he would make. Lucas didn't laugh. Exactly. He's always at the sites. He's always near the dam. People already associate him with work zones. Then I heard Rachel's voice, quieter than the others. She didn't sound excited. She sounded careful. So what's the official line? Lucas answered without hesitation. Violation? Safety negligence? He cuts corners? He thinks he knows better. That's how we frame it. I sat back in my chair like the air had been knocked out of me. Because suddenly, every little thing in my life had a second meaning. My routine didn't just make me predictable, it made me believable, and I realized something I'd never considered before. Something most people don't think about until it's too late. A clean death isn't just a death with no blood. A clean death is a death with a story that makes everyone stop asking questions. A reason that sounds familiar, a reason people can nod at and say, yeah, that tracks. I listened to the next file. Another timestamp. Wednesday. 4:52 a.m. This one had clearer audio, like whoever recorded it was closer. Lucas again. We'll keep it simple. He slips, he falls, impact, water, or he goes over the edge and it looks like he wasn't paying attention. Claire interrupted. And if someone asks why he was there that early, Rachel answered this time. And her voice was so smooth it almost didn't sound like her. He checks the site before crews arrive sometimes. He likes being first. That was true. And hearing her use a true detail like it was a weapon, that's when I stopped seeing this as betrayal. This was something colder. This was someone studying me the way you study a map. Lucas spoke again. We'll make sure there's a report. If he's dead, the investigators will look for a simple cause. Give them one, Claire said. And the land Lucas lowered his voice like he was talking about dessert. Once he's gone, it's a clean transfer. The rights, the claim, the payout. It all moves faster when there's no dispute. Then there was a pause, like someone shifted in their seat, and Claire said, almost casually, we should be done before her appointment. Rachel didn't respond right away. Lucas did. She's due in a few months. That's why the timing matters. We need it locked in. Due. That word hit me harder than any of the others. Because it wasn't just money. It was a timeline, a deadline. A baby, whether it was real or just another tool, was the kind of pressure that made people reckless. And suddenly the whole thing felt like a contract. A deal being closed. I stopped the recording and just stared into the dark. The house was silent. The air conditioner clicked on and off. Somewhere down the hall, Rachel's breathing was slow and even, like she was sleeping peacefully. And for a second, I had this strange, sick thought. Maybe she really was sleeping. Maybe to her, this wasn't even emotional anymore. Maybe it was just scheduled. I went back to the journal and scanned the notes that were written beside that Wednesday timestamp. Short phrases, low visibility, maintenance blind spot, liability angle, safety narrative, liability angle, safety narrative. Those weren't murder words. Those were corporate words, legal words, words that told you their goal wasn't just to kill me, it was to kill my reputation with me. So even if someone felt uneasy, even if someone asked, was this really an accident? There would be a file, a report, a reason, a story ready to hand them, and that's when the countdown became real. Because I didn't have weeks, I didn't have months, I had 2 mornings, 2 sunrises, and a Wednesday that was already circled in their minds like an appointment they didn't intend to miss. Follow this story to the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know how far this lesson reaches, because what I'm about to say isn't just about betrayal, it's about survival. Once I realized they had picked a day to lose me, I stopped asking myself emotional questions. I stopped asking, why would she do this? And I started asking the only question that mattered. What do I need to have in my hands so I don't die twice? Because that's what they were trying to do. They weren't just trying to end my life. They were trying to end my name with it. A dead man can't defend himself. A dead man can't correct a story. A dead man can't walk into a courtroom and say, "That's not who I am." So I decided I wasn't going to give them the luxury of a clean narrative. And I did it the way grown men are supposed to do it. Not with fists, not with threats, with paperwork, with timelines, with witnesses, with the law. The first thing I did was separate my life from hers. Quietly. I didn't drain accounts. I didn't make dramatic transfers that would trigger alerts. I opened a new account at a credit union in the next town, over the kind of place where the teller still looks you in the eye and asks how your mother's doing. I moved enough money to cover a lawyer, a motel, and a few weeks of breathing room. Not because I planned to run, because I planned to keep my options. Then I started building a timeline. It sounds boring, but it saved me. I took a legal pad and wrote down everything I knew with dates and times. When the dinner happened, when the envelope landed in my hand, the exact file names, the timestamps, the voices I recognized. I wrote down Rachel's work calls, her late errands, the mornings she pushed me to visit the dam, and the more I wrote, the more I realized something that made my stomach twist. A lot of it wasn't new. It had been hiding in plain sight, dressed up as concern. Be careful out there. Don't work too late. You've been so stressed. Maybe take a walk. I used to hear that as love. Now I heard it as someone rehearsing lines. Next, I made copies of the recordings. Not 1 copy. Not 2. 3. I saved one on a flash drive I taped under the bottom drawer in my office behind an old stack of project bids nobody touched. I saved another on an encrypted folder and sent it to an email address Rachel didn't know existed. And the third, I put somewhere I wouldn't have access to in a panic, because panic makes you make mistakes, and mistakes are how people like them win. After that, I went to the most boring place on earth, a lawyer's office. Not the kind with glass walls and fancy art. The kind with worn carpet, a stack of files on the corner of the desk, and a receptionist who still says, "Good morning, honey." I didn't call ahead. I didn't make an appointment from my phone. I walked in like a man asking about property paperwork. And when the lawyer finally sat with me, I didn't start with the affair. I didn't start with the pregnancy rumor. I slid the recorder across the desk and said, calmly, "I need you to listen to this. And I need you to tell me what I should do, without tipping my hand." He listened. His face didn't change much at first. Then his eyes narrowed. Then he stopped the audio and looked at me like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. He said, "Do you feel safe going home tonight?" And that's when it hit me. I wasn't imagining this. A professional was hearing what I heard and taking it seriously. He told me something I will never forget. He said, "In cases like this, people don't lose because they don't have the truth. They lose because they can't prove it in a way that holds up." So we did the next grown-up thing. We started locking down my documents. We reviewed my will. We pulled my insurance information. We looked at ownership paperwork connected to the land near the dam rights, easements, all the boring stuff most people ignore until it ruins them. Because if something happened to me, I didn't want Rachel holding the pen while everyone else held their breath. And then we talked about witnesses. Not friends, not family. Witnesses. People with clean motives. People who would show up and tell the truth even if it made them uncomfortable. I thought about my circle. I didn't have many people. But I had one. A man I'd worked with for years older. Steady. The kind of guy who doesn't gossip and doesn't get pulled into drama. I asked him to meet me for coffee early the next morning. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough to make him understand one thing. If anything happens to me, you need to know where to look. His face went pale. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He just nodded. Because real men don't need a whole speech when they can see danger in your eyes. And while I was building all of that, I discovered something that made it even worse. They weren't just planning my accident. They were building my character assassination. I found it the next day at one of my sites. It wasn't a recording. It was a pattern. A casual comment from a guy I barely knew. He said, "Hey, you're Ethan, right? Heard you're kinda loose with the safety rules." He said it like it was nothing, like it was common knowledge. I smiled like it was a joke. But inside, I felt ice, because I'm not loose with safety. I'm the guy who annoys people with checklists. I'm the guy who shuts work down if something doesn't feel right. So why would someone say that? And then I understood they were planting a witness, not someone who saw me die. Someone who could say, after I was gone, "Yeah, Ethan was careless. He always took risks." They wanted my death to feel deserved. They wanted the town to shrug. They wanted the investigators to have an easy conclusion. That's when my plan got even simpler. No more guessing, no more hoping. If they were going to use a story against me, I was going to use a record against them. Because feelings fade, arguments get twisted, but files don't. Timelines don't. Paper doesn't. And from that point on, every move I made had one purpose: to make sure that when they tried to erase me, they ended up signing their own names instead. 2 days after I started building my paper trail, I went back to the recorder and listened again, this time with my notebook open, stopping after every sentence like I was studying for an exam I didn't want to take. Most of the files were recent. They sounded current, confident, organized. But then I noticed something small. One file name didn't match the rest. The date was older, months older, and the timestamp was late after midnight. I almost skipped it. I figured it was just background noise, a false lead, something that wouldn't matter. But my gut told me to press play. The first thing I heard wasn't plotting. It was silence. The kind of silence you hear when someone is sitting in a room, thinking too hard, trying to convince themselves they're not the kind of person who does what they're about to do. Then Rachel's voice came in. Not sweet, not polished, not the voice she used when she asked how my day went. This was smaller, tired, almost scared. She said, "We need to stop." And my hand actually froze on the table, because for weeks I had been forcing myself to see her as my enemy. It was the only way I could function. It was the only way I could keep my face calm across the dinner table. But hearing her say that hearing hesitation in her voice did something dangerous, it made my brain reach for hope. It made me want to believe there was still a version of my wife inside that body. She continued, like she was trying to talk herself out of drowning. "I don't like how this feels. I thought it would be different. I thought it was just paperwork. Money. But it's not." There was a crack in the word "not," like she almost cried, but swallowed it. And for one stupid second, I thought, maybe this is where it turns. Maybe she backs out. Maybe she confesses. Maybe she chooses me. Then a second voice cut through the room like a blade, calm, flat, patient, Claire. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult Rachel. She didn't even sound angry. That's what made it terrifying. She said, "Rachel, you don't get to be dramatic now." The way she said Rachel's name, it wasn't friendship, it was ownership. Rachel tried again. "I'm serious. I can't do this." Claire interrupted, still calm. "You can't do this. Or you can't handle the consequences of doing this." Then there was a pause. A long one. And you could hear Rachel breathing. Short, shallow breaths. Like someone realizing the room has no exits. Claire continued, almost gently, like she was explaining something to a child. "Let's be clear. If you walk away, you don't walk away clean," Rachel whispered. "Don't." That one word told me everything. It wasn't, don't say it. It was please don't remind me who I used to be. Claire didn't flinch. She said, "You want to pretend your past stays buried, it doesn't. Not if you make me dig." And then she said something that made my stomach turn cold. She said, "I still have the photos. I still have the paperwork. I still have the name of the person who helped you. I'm the reason you're not in cuffs right now." My brain started filling in blanks I didn't even want to imagine. I didn't know what Rachel had done. I didn't know if it was theft, fraud, some old case, some mistake she thought she'd outrun. But I knew what this was. Leverage. Pure leverage. Claire wasn't just a friend who got pulled into something messy. Claire was the lock on Rachel's throat. Rachel tried to speak, but her voice shook now. "You promised me it would be safe." Claire let out a soft laugh. Not amused, not warm, just satisfied. "Safe," she said. "Nothing is safe. Not for people like us. That's why we do it right the first time. People like us." That phrase landed like a slap, because in Rachel's world, she had a category for herself now. Not wife, not partner, not family. A category that included crimes, and plans, and exits. Rachel went quiet again, and I could almost picture her, sitting with her hands in her lap, eyes down, trying to decide whether she was scared of me or scared of Claire. Then Claire delivered the line that made everything crystal clear. She said, "Listen to me. You don't get to grow a conscience in the middle of a contract. A contract, that's what I was to them. Not a husband, not a person. A problem with a payout." Rachel's voice came back, smaller than before. "I didn't want it to be like this." Claire didn't comfort her. She didn't say, "It'll be okay." She said, "It is like this. Because you already said yes. And if you try to say no now, you'll lose everything." And then she added, almost as an afterthought, "including your freedom." I sat there, staring at the recorder like it had turned into a live grenade. Because that file changed something important. Up until that moment, my story had been simple. Rachel betrayed me. Rachel wanted me gone. But the truth was uglier and more complicated. Rachel wasn't just betraying me. Rachel was trapped, and still choosing to sacrifice me to save herself. And Claire wasn't just an accomplice. She was the person who built the cage and held the key. That's when I understood a lesson I wish someone had taught me a long time ago. A lot of evil doesn't start with someone being born cold. It starts when someone gets caught. It starts when someone is ashamed. It starts when someone is being controlled. And then, instead of admitting the truth and paying the price, they decide it's easier to make someone else disappear. And in that moment, standing alone in my quiet house, I realized something else too. If Rachel could be controlled, then Claire could be exposed. And that meant my real enemy wasn't the person smiling across from me at the dinner table. It was the person whispering behind her, guiding every move like a hand inside a puppet. And once you see the hand, you stop arguing with the puppet. I already know what you're thinking, because if you were watching this from the outside, you'd say the same thing I said to myself the first night. What kind of idiots record their own plan? Who talks about insurance, camera blind spots, and timelines like they're ordering takeout? Who leaves it in a place where it can be found? And I asked that question too, right up until I understood what those recordings actually were to them. They weren't evidence. They were workflow. That's the part people don't want to admit, because it makes the world feel colder. Modern crime doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like a calendar invite. Sometimes it looks like a checklist. Lucas lived in risk reports and liability language. Claire lived in leverage and control. Rachel lived in the performance. Together. They didn't feel like criminals. They felt like professionals. So the recorder wasn't a weapon to them. It was a notebook, a way to keep details straight. A way to rehearse the story until it sounded natural. And the reason they dared to keep it, because they didn't see me as a variable. They saw me as a fixed number. I was predictable. I was the man who woke up at 5:40, drank black coffee, drove to the dam project twice a week, and believed his marriage was solid because it had been quiet for years. They weren't worried I'd find anything because, in their minds, I wasn't the kind of man who looked. That's what arrogance does. It doesn't just make you bold, it makes you lazy. When someone believes they're smarter than you, they stop hiding. They start organizing. They start labeling files with dates like they're proud of their own efficiency. They start speaking in shorthand because they assume no one else will ever hear it. And that's why those recordings sounded the way they did. Not emotional, not frantic, practical, like they were building a deck, not ending a life. Once I saw that, my fear changed shape. I stopped asking, why would they record this? And I started asking the only question that mattered. What else did they assume I'll never do? They assumed I'd confront Rachel, blow up, get angry, make noise. They assumed I'd run to the police with one shaky recording and a story that sounded insane. They assumed I'd act like a wounded husband, because that's how men like me usually act when their world breaks. And that assumption was the first crack in their armor, because I wasn't going to beat them with emotion. I was going to beat them with procedure. If their plan was built like paperwork, then I had to respond the same way. I started treating their arrogance like a door they forgot to lock, not by kicking it in, by walking through quietly, with gloves on. I built a timeline, every file name, every timestamp, every phrase they repeated, every detail about the dam, the lot near the spillway, the insurance language Lucas used like it was his native tongue. I wrote it down the way an investigator would, not the way a husband would. Then I did something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I rehearsed my own role, because if they were going to use my predictability against me, I was going to weaponize their predictability against them. Claire liked control. so I needed to give her the illusion of control. Lucas liked certainty, so I needed to feed him numbers and clean logic. And Rachel liked comfort. She liked routines that felt safe. So I stayed routine. I laughed at the right moments. I asked about her day. I ate dinner like I wasn't swallowing nails. And all the while, I was building a stage. Because the truth is, most people don't get caught because someone is stronger. They get caught because they get comfortable. They get caught because they start believing their own story. They get caught because they think they can't lose. That's what Claire sounded like on those recordings. Not scared, not rushed, certain. And certainty makes people sloppy. It makes them talk. It makes them over-explain. It makes them leave dumb proof behind because they don't even recognize it as proof anymore. They think it's just their private system, their private language, their private game. So I stopped trying to break their plan head on. I decided to let it breathe, let it move, let them step into it with the same confidence they'd been using to step over everyone else. Because the best trap isn't the one you force someone into. It's the one they walk into smiling. Because they're convinced they're the hunter. And once I realized that, I finally understood something I'd never understood before. The people who love control the most often lose for the same reason. They're so sure they're untouchable. They don't notice the moment the power shifts. And that's exactly what I was counting on. Follow this until the end. And comment the city you're watching from because I need you to understand something I didn't survive by being loud. I survived by being precise. The countdown they set for me was a Wednesday morning, before sunrise, the kind of hour where even the birds sound tired. They chose it because the road near the dam stayed empty, and the maintenance cameras had a blind spot that only a contractor would notice. That morning, my alarm still went off at 5:40. I still made coffee. I still put on my work boots. I even kissed Rachel on the forehead the way I always did. And then I broke the script. I didn't drive to the dam. I drove past it, slow, quiet, like I was paying my last respects to a place that had almost become my grave. A mile down the road, I pulled into a turnout and parked where I could see the main access gate from a distance. I sat there with the engine off, watching the fog crawl across the water like a living thing. And I waited, not for heroics, for proof. At 6:18, a black SUV rolled in and stopped near the service entrance. At 6:21, another car, older, gray, the kind of vehicle people choose when they don't want attention. I didn't need a license plate to feel my stomach tighten, because I recognized the shape of that plan. 2 vehicles, 2 rolls, 1 accident. For 10 minutes, nothing moved. Then the gray car backed up. Corrected. Backed up again like someone was getting impatient. Like someone was realizing I wasn't where I was supposed to be. And that was the moment I knew. They hadn't just talked about it. They showed up for it. I didn't call them. I didn't chase them. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing my face. I simply recorded what I could, noted the times, and drove home like a man who had just taken his life back without anyone noticing. That night, Rachel asked me if I'd been by the site. Her voice was soft, concerned, wife-like. I looked at her and gave her the same calm smile I'd been practicing for weeks. "Not today," I said. They pushed the inspection. She nodded too quickly, and then she reached for my hand. Her palm was warm, but her grip was wrong, like she was checking if I was still there. 3 days later, I hosted a small anniversary dinner at our house. Nothing fancy, just intentional. The kind of evening Rachel loved because it looked like stability. Candles, a clean tablecloth, the good plates we only used twice a year. I made ribeye. She made that lemon herb salad she was proud of. And I invited the right people. Lucas came because I framed it as clearing the air about a policy issue tied to the land near the dam. He liked meetings that sounded official. Claire came because Rachel asked her to, and Claire never missed a chance to be close to the center of a story. I also invited my attorney, Mark, as a family friend, and I asked my neighbor, Denise, retired, sharp, the kind of woman who remembered dates better than your own mother, to stop by for dessert. Witnesses, normal faces, a safe room, because the final stage wasn't about yelling. It was about removing their exits. We ate, we smiled, we made small talk. I watched Rachel refill Claire's wine a little too quickly. I watched Lucas scan the room like he was counting doors. And I watched Claire watch me like she was waiting for the old Ethan to crack. Halfway through dinner, I brought up the bait. I've been thinking, I said, cutting my steak slow, about transferring the parcel near the spillway, the one tied to the insurance valuation. Lucas leaned forward before he realized he'd moved. Claire's eyes sharpened. Rachel stopped chewing. I let the silence sit there. Then I asked, casually, like it was nothing. If something happened to me out there, how fast would a claim even pay? Lucas answered too fast. He started explaining timelines, liability language, industry standard, and Claire couldn't help herself. She corrected him. One small detail, a detail she only knew because she'd been in the room when it was planned. That's when I reached into my pocket and set the recorder on the table. Small, black, ordinary. The room didn't change all at once. It froze in pieces. Rachel's fork hovered mid-air. Lucas's jaw tightened. Claire's smile stayed on her face for one extra second, then fell like a mask slipping off. I pressed play, and the voice that filled my dining room wasn't emotional. It was organized. It was them, talking about blind spots and violations and the cleanest narrative. Rachel whispered my name. Not in love, in warning. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I just looked at her and said, very calmly, how long were you going to let them rehearse my death in our life? Mark stood up. Denise didn't move an inch. And when the police arrived, because Mark had already called them before dessert hit the table, Claire finally spoke. You think you're so smart. And I said, no. I just stopped pretending love means letting people cross your boundaries. They were taken out of my house the same way they tried to take me out of this world. Quietly. By procedure, later. When the paperwork settled and the town got tired of whispering, I moved, not out of fear, out of respect for myself. I sold the house that had been staged like a set. I bought a small cabin near the Highland Ridge, where mornings were honest and silence didn't feel like a threat. And that's the part nobody tells you about survival. Leaving in dignity is the fastest kind of healing, because boundaries don't destroy love. They only destroy the illusion that someone can hurt you and still call it care.